programma che state per vedere è la storia della Ferrari. Correre per la Ferrari è l'ambizione di tutti i piloti. Il marchio del cavallino rampante è un marchio importante in tutto il mondo e ogni pilota che ha avuto la possibilità di correre per questa casa prestigiosa, anche il giorno dopo aver lasciato la casa del cavallino e anche negli anni dopo, riserva sempre verso il pubblico e la gran quantità di gente che seguono l'automobilismo e non un ricordo indelebile. È una scuderia tutta particolare che procura al pilota una grossa esperienza sia tecnica che corsaiola. Solo conoscere un uomo come Ferrari, la cui personalità è spiccatissima, è una cosa che lascia un segno negli anni futuri. Personalmente ho incontrato il commendatore Ferrari nel 1968, alla fine del 68, e quindi ancora oggi ne riservo un grosso ricordo. Il marchio della Ferrari è ormai diventato un mito e sempre più oggetto di ricerca dei collezionisti. In tutto il mondo questo marchio ha raggiunto delle quotazioni elevatissime e non a caso anch'io oggi, dopo 9 anni che ho lasciato la squadra del Cavallino, mi ritrovo a guidare una vettura da competizione degli anni 60, quindi oggi ancora di più apprezzo la validità e la meccanica di queste prestigiose vetture.
"15 kilometers from Modena, along the road leading up to the hills of Abetone, lies Maranello, a small town of around 14,000 inhabitants. To millions of motor racing fans, it is a place which immediately conjures up the name of Enzo Ferrari, a legend within the motor industry. In Maranello, everything brings to mind motor racing and engines, even though the grand old man of motor racing died in August 1988. The street names are no exception, being dedicated to Enzo Ferrari's son Dino and to some of the marque's most famous drivers, such as Villeneuve, Ascari, Musso and Nuvolari. This is the Cavallino restaurant, directly opposite the factory gates. For many decades it enjoyed the patronage of Il Commendatore, as Enzo Ferrari was popularly known, although he disliked the nickname, and his closest associates. Some 100 metres from the factory nestles the renowned motorsports department, and it's from here that technicians and mechanics set off to look after Maranello's most potent products on the circuits of the world. Every day, 200 people, most of them locally based, pass through these gates in order to design and build the world's most famous sports and racing cars. Each of them is proud of their association, and each approaches their task with painstaking care. On the ground floor is the office used by Enzo Ferrari himself, right through until the end of his life. For years, the most important decisions were taken within these walls. To have an audience in this particular room was always a privilege, open only to a precious few. The racing department, where entry is normally out of the question, opens its doors only for the press presentation of new models. This part of the factory is immediately adjacent to Fiorano, Ferrari's superbly equipped private test facility, which was christened by Niki Lauda in the autumn of 1973. Ferrari's roots in Maranello date back to 1943, when Il Commendatore moved his business from Modena to new premises built on a plot of land he already owned. Initially, machine tool components formed the bulk of Ferrari's output. Only at the end of the Second World War did the first cars see the light of day. 3 cars were built in 1947 and 5 were produced the following year. Thereafter, productivity increased by the year, but the 1000th Ferrari wasn't constructed until the late 1950s. 30 years later, the day after Enzo Ferrari's death, the Maranello Public Relations Department issued a press release commemorating the arrival of the 50,000th Ferrari. In all, there have been over 200 different Ferrari models, each a prestigious and expensive status symbol, from the 166mm in 1949 to the 250 GTO of the early 60s, and from the Testarossa to the F40. As far as motorsport is concerned, there have been over 5,000 overall victories, around 30 world titles, over 100 Formula One Grand Prix successes, and dozens of triumphs in the Mille Miglia, Le Mans 24 Hours, and the Targa Florio. In each era, some of the sport's greatest drivers have brought success to the prancing horse, from Ascari to Fangio, from Bandini to Lauda, from Regazzoni to Villeneuve. Each of them has helped to create the myth of Ferrari, and some of them have paid the ultimate price. Enzo Ferrari was born in Modena on February the 18th, 1898, in the apartment above his father's engineering works. At the age of 10, he accompanied his dad to an early race on the Via Emilia, giving him a youthful taste for speed. In 1919, he went to work for CMN in Milan, operating as a quality controller within a truck factory. His ardent dream, however, was to become a racing driver. On October the 5th that year, he contested the Parma to Poggio di Bercetto hill climb in this CMN, the factory having diversified from its tractor-building origins. Moving to Alfa Romeo in 1920, he was placed in no fewer than 20 races. Of particular note was second places overall in the 1920 Targa Florio and the 1924 Coppa Acerbo, both of them being prestigious events. His companions at the time were Ugo Sivocci, Antonio Ascari and Giuseppe Campari. Years later, Ferrari made the proud boast that he'd finished every race he'd started. He gave up racing in 1931, just prior to becoming a father. Here, Ferrari sits on the right hand of a group which includes Professor Nicola Romeo, the founder of Alfa Romeo. Ferrari's relationship with Alfa was complex. As well as driving, he also acted as the firm's motorsports administrator. In 1929, he set up Scuderia Ferrari, a team dedicated to running Alfas. Still keen on driving, Ferrari is seen here driving car number 19. And we have been lucky enough to find this valuable contemporary newsreel material of the event.
spettatori lo sforzo è terribile. Sono 800 km ad una media di 110 km orari, 7 ore senza un minuto di riposo. Il suo compagno di squadra, Campari, vince la corsa su un'altra Alfa. Nel Gran Premio d'Italia, Ascari e la squadra dell'Alfa conquistano il primo, secondo, terzo e quarto posto.
This is the triumphant arrival of Tazio Nuvolari, a man who dominated some of the most prestigious international motor racing events for Scuderia Ferrari in the 1930s.
Sul circuito del Nürburgring, infatti, Nuvolari conquistò quella che molti ritengono la più bella vittoria della sua carriera. In quinta posizione all'inizio, in testa a metà gara, di nuovo in quinta posizione per il tempo perduto nei rifornimenti, Nuvolari recuperò il primo posto negli ultimi 8 giri.
Encouraged by the numerous successes of his team, Ferrari decided to take the plunge and to become a constructor in his own right. The first official Ferrari, completed in 1947, made its debut at Piacenza on May 11th. In Franco Cortese's hands, it was leading when the fuel pump broke. 15 days later, the same driver compensated with victory in the Gran Premio di Roma. This 1.5-litre V12, the Type 125, had the dual privilege of being the first Ferrari to win in competition and the first to carry the prancing horse logo, derived from that of Italy's First World War flying hero, Francesco Baracca. In 1950, the World Motor Racing Championship was inaugurated. Alfa Romeo emerged victorious in that initial season, but Ferrari's first victory was not too long coming. In the 1951 British Grand Prix at Silverstone, the Argentinian Gonzalez, something of a heavyweight at over 100 kilograms, gave Ferrari its first success in this new competition. In 1952, popular Milanese Alberto Ascari dominated the season for Ferrari, winning 7 out of 8 events. He didn't enter the 8th, the Indianapolis 500. Ascari gave Maranello its first world title in a successful year which also brought many sports car victories. Amongst these was an outright win on the Mille Miglia, an event Ferrari would go on to win on 7 further occasions. By the end of the decade, Ferrari's CV was decidedly impressive, with 3 Formula One titles and 5 World Sports Car Championship crowns. In the subsequent decade, 2 more Formula One Championship wins and 10 sports car championships further enhanced the company's reputation. The Italian constructor was now recognized as one of the names to beat on racing circuits the world over. In 1969, Ferrari struck up its alliance with Fiat, although full control of the racing team was always left to Il Commendatore himself. But that was the start of a lean period in Formula One, which ended in 1974 with the arrival of Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni, the latter just missing out on the world title. Lauda proved to be the dominant driver in both 75 and 77, however, winning 2 world titles. Lauda's sudden and controversial departure heralded the arrival of the rapid, instinctive and charismatic Gilles Villeneuve. Ably supported by this popular French-Canadian, Jody Scheckter brought Ferrari another world title in 1979, the marque's 9th in total.
Je pense que l'écurie Ferrari a un poids extrêmement important. Certains Grands Prix, peut-être que si Ferrari n'y est pas, ça ne changera peut-être pas beaucoup pour ce qui est du public, mais je pense que la majorité des Grands Prix, que ce soit en Autriche, à Monaco, en France, en Italie, même en Allemagne, si la voiture Ferrari n'y est pas, il y a peut-être 30% de la foule qui n'y est pas. Alors je pense qu'effectivement, Ferrari a beaucoup plus de poids que n'importe quelle autre écurie en Formule 1, parce que ça fait une 50aine d'années qu'ils sont en course automobile, qu'ils ont eu les plus grands résultats, et que jamais une Williams, que jamais une McLaren, que jamais une Brabham aura 10% de la popularité de l'écurie Ferrari.
The 1980s, the age of the turbo in Formula One, was an unhappy time for Ferrari. Villeneuve was killed, and both Didier Pironi and René Arnoux narrowly missed out on possible championship titles. The magic of Ferrari remained, however, as 3 times world champion Jackie Stewart explains.
The name Ferrari is synonymous with motor racing. I think that his name, more than any other, has been associated with Grand Prix racing. If you say Ferrari, you mean racing. There are very few names in the world of people who are alive who are that well known. Even products, you can think of maybe Coca-Cola, you can think of maybe Ford, and when you say Ferrari, you know what it means. It means excellence, it means speed. And of course, Mr. Ferrari's involvement in motor racing has been an amazing contribution, not only to the sport, but also to Italy. The reputation that the country has gained through the success of Ferrari has been wonderful.
Correre per una casa che ha una storia importantissima nell'ambito delle corse automobilistiche, la soddisfazione di poter guidare, magari qualche volta vincere con una squadra italiana e avere la possibilità di imparare tantissime cose con tutto quello che la Ferrari ti mette a disposizione.
Molti parlano, molti scrivono della Ferrari. La Ferrari non è un mito, la Ferrari non è un fenomeno. La Ferrari è un'azienda governata, difesa e va avanti perché raccoglie tanta gente di buona volontà che ha l'entusiasmo per il lavoro, che ha passione per le costruzioni che fa, che ha voglia di mantenere intatta la propria tradizione e soprattutto è un'azienda che sa instillare nei propri collaboratori il senso dell'orgoglio di appartenere a questa famiglia. Io ho sempre pensato che le fabbriche sono fatte prima di uomini, poi di mezzi tecnici e infine di muri. La Ferrari è fatta soprattutto di uomini ed è per questo che continuerà il suo cammino anche dopo di me.
So now sit back and reflect on 4 decades of Ferrari single-seater successes, from Ascari and Gonzalez in the 1950s, to Phil Hill and Surtees in the 1960s, Lauda, Regazzoni, Scheckter and Villeneuve in the 1970s, Arnoux and Alboreto in the 80s, and many, many others besides. The 1980s saw the beginning of the turbo engine era. After the death of Villeneuve and the problems with Pironi, McLaren consolidated its predominant position whilst the all-Italian experiment with Alboreto failed, thus leaving it to Prost and Mansell to try and salvage the fortunes of Ferrari. Now let's look back on Ferrari's myriad sports car racing successes in the Targa Florio, the Mille Miglia, at Le Mans, the Nürburgring, Sebring and Daytona, to name just some of the Italian company's most spectacular conquests in this prominent and keenly contested form of racing. Ferrari started its long run of sports car successes as early as 1953. Let's dwell for a moment on the Mille Miglia, one of the most charismatic and demanding events in the history of sports car racing, a competition that even the most illustrious drivers held in awe. One Manuel Fangio, world champion on a record 5 occasions, once said that he wanted to win it, simply so that he would no longer have to take part in the event. From 1927 until 1957, there were 24 Mille Miglias. Ferrari, which had only come into being after the war, won 8 of them. This is Eugenio Castellotti, being chaired away by fans after winning the grueling 1956 event. 12 hours of arduous racing in the driving rain. 1 year later, Piero Taruffi took his Ferrari 315S to victory in what would be the last race of its kind, its demise brought about by a serious accident which cost the lives of the competing Marquis de Portago, his co-driver Ed Nelson and 9 spectators. For all that, the 1950s remained perhaps the brightest period in Ferrari's history. These shots are of the 860 Monza of Fangio and Castellotti during the 1956 Nürburgring 1,000 kilometres, on one of the toughest and most demanding racetracks in the world. This time, they had to give second best to the Maserati of Sterling Moss and Jean Bira. In the following years, Ferrari faced many challenges from rival sports car manufacturers. The patriotically presented Aston Martins, finished in British Racing Green, took the world title in 1959, but Ferrari retaliated immediately. Ferrari would be world sports car champion every season from 1960 to 1964, thanks to both the works entries and many privately entered cars. By the mid-1960s, there was another potent adversary on the horizon, Ford. At that point, the American giant had entered negotiations to assume control of Ferrari, but no agreement was ever reached. Always one to have his say, Enzo Ferrari rattled the Americans with a victory in the 1964 Sebring 12 Hours, thanks to Mike Parks and Umberto Maglioli. This coveted trophy fell into Ferrari's hands on 9 occasions. In 1965, there was an emotional all-Italian triumph in the Targa Florio, the world's oldest surviving motor race at that time. On the tortuous Sicilian mountain roads, Nino Vaccarella and Lorenzo Bandini rose to the occasion in their Ferrari P2. 2 years later, in 1967, as Ford's sports car activity was at its most feverish, Ferrari claimed yet another world title in the category. By 1969, Porsche, later to have a profound influence on the shape of sports car racing, took over as the dominant force. the Maranello technicians battled unsuccessfully against the odds, producing increasingly effective models, but finding that continuous fluctuations in the series regulations made their already difficult task impossible. Not until 1972 did Ferrari reclaim the title with its flat 12-engined 312P. The fight for the title lasted the whole season, but it was the final time that a Ferrari would win the World Sports Car title. Indeed, it was the last time that Ferrari took part. The world of rallying merits a brief mention. The Prancing Horse scored its first rally success in the 1952 Moroccan Rally.
Io quando l'ho provato la prima volta la macchina di serie, la 308 GTB, c'è un concessionario francese, non ho più pensato che a guidare questa macchina perché l'ho trovato già commerciale, quello che troviamo nel commercio fantastica e ho saputo subito che si poteva fare una macchina favolosa.
In 1979, Lele Pinto won the Monza Rally with a specially prepared Ferrari. And Jean-Claude Androuet also used a 308 GTB to good effect in rallying. Furthermore, the Maranello-designed 2.4-litre six-cylinder Dino engine also powered the fabulous Lancia Stratos to an endless succession of world rally honours in the mid-1970s. 3 world titles, 2 European titles, 4 Monte Carlo victories, 5 Tour de Corse and 5 San Remo rallies, an enviable record. Despite its mainly glorious history, the story of the Prancing Horse also has its sadder moments. For every accident that has borne tragic consequences, Ferrari found himself under severe scrutiny from the notoriously critical and sometimes imaginative Italian press. After the shocking accident during the 1957 Mille Miglia, Ferrari was even charged with homicide, an accusation which he wasn't to be cleared of for 4.5 years, during which time he remained in Maranello, never uttering a word about the case. Here's a chilling sequence from the TV news of September the 10th, 1961. A dreadful accident was to befall Ferrari at Monza, in which 12 people were to die and 21 were seriously injured, when Von Tripp's car came off the track and ploughed straight into the crowd. The accident happened at the entry to the Parabolica. This sad, though dramatic footage was taken by a Ferrari engineer. Von Tripp's car somersaulted over Clark whilst travelling at around 120 miles an hour and smacked straight into the safety netting, behind which were gathered thousands of spectators. The car bounced back off the netting and back into the middle of the track, Von Trips being thrown across to the opposite side of the track. The marshals were quick to rush onto the track to guide the other cars around the wreckage, but tragically, Von Trips had been killed instantly. Pieces of the wreckage were recovered from amongst the crowd up to 50 meters from the accident. These sad and graphic images show the full horror of the accident and serve to remind us of the price that is sometimes paid by those who entertain us so excitingly. Von Trips was only 33 years old. These newsreel pictures show us the full extent of this awful accident. Paramedics were immediately on the scene, but the full picture of the catastrophe did not emerge for several hours. 19 of the injured were taken to hospital in Monza, whilst another 6 were taken to other local hospitals. The accident of Von Trips shocked Enzo Ferrari deeply. On many occasions after tragic accidents, Ferrari contemplated and threatened a complete withdrawal from all competitions. He never went through with it, however, his resolve inevitably strengthened by his philosophy that driver error was the root cause of the catastrophe in the majority of cases. Lorenzo Bandini's accident at Monaco in 1967 was another painful reminder of what can go wrong. On the 81st lap, Bandini clipped the barriers at the entrance to the harbour. The single-seater rode up into the air before crashing down onto the circuit, on fire, with its luckless driver trapped inside. After 3 agonising days in hospital, poor Bandini finally succumbed to his terrible burns, and Italy lost one of its most popular performers. Mercifully, fiery accidents do not always have such unhappy consequences. At the start of the 1970 Spanish Grand Prix, Jackie Icks's Ferrari was hit forcefully by Jackie Oliver's BRM and burst into flames. Fortunately, Icks remained conscious and was able to scramble clear, although he suffered some burns. Niki Lauda miraculously escaped from this frightening accident at the Nürburgring on August 1st, 1976, after his Ferrari slewed out of control and hit the barriers, rebounding back onto the track in flames. Lauda, unconscious, was saved by swift action from marshals and fellow drivers. He was driving again 40 days later. On Saturday, May the 8th, 1982, Gilles Villeneuve struck a rear wheel of Jochen Mass's March during qualifying for the Belgium Grand Prix at Zolder. The Ferrari took off and somersaulted down the track, Villeneuve being thrown clear as the chassis disintegrated. A few hours later, the man who had so captured the imagination of the motor racing world, especially in Italy, was dead. Enzo Ferrari always maintained that the most important element of a competitive racing car was its engine. The following factory tour, from the foundry to the test benches, and from the assembly line to the final chassis, focuses on the gestation of the 6-cylinder turbo engine, one of over 150 engines conceived at Maranello since 1946. The evolutionary process bringing together space-age technology and meticulous, old-fashioned craftsmanship.
avuto già occasione di dire che io
As I've often said, there have been many occasions when I've followed the drivers not just logically, but also emotionally. I believe that it is vital to have two very fast drivers on the team. What's the point in having just one driver that can reach a high level of speed when you can have two? It doesn't interest me. It just doesn't interest me. The so-called second driver is a wonderful luxury that I just can't afford. It's so much better to have two drivers that race each other and are rivals. It's obvious. Should the occasion arise that the antagonism, born of the rivalry, interferes with the interests of the team, then, and only then, will I interfere. Here are a few portraits of leading drivers who carried the prancing horse insignia with pride. The comments are the personal thoughts of Enzo Ferrari, who collected them together in a volume entitled Pilote C'è gente. My first meeting with Nuvolari dates back to 1924. During a race on the Savio circuit, I was driving a 3-litre Alfa, while he was at the wheel of a Kiri Biri. We crossed the finishing line in that same order and became friends. When, in 1947, I began racing in a car bearing my own name, he came and said, "Ferrari, I'm ready." Alberto Ascari's debut was in the 1940 Mille race driving an 815 model. I remember he had a rock-fast willpower and exhibited a precise and firm style of driving, but he was the man who had to start first in the lineup. Once ahead, Ascari was hard to catch, if not impossible. Driving with Ferrari, he became world champion in 1952 and 53. He died at Monza on May the 26th, 1955. Villarisi was a true champion on account of his style, his daring, and would make the most out of his machine. Froilan Gonzalez, one of Fangio's countrymen, was his exact opposite, the Cabazzoni as everyone used to call him. In the lead, he'd inexplicably slow down and be overtaken. In pursuit, he was a destroyer of adversaries. He won the first World Grand Prix for Ferrari. Mike Hawthorne came to Modena on my invitation in 1953, escorted by his father, his #1 fan. A tall, fair and distracted young man who would remain tied to the name Ferrari for some years, and for whom racing a Ferrari conquered the highest accolade in 1958 by winning a long, drawn-out duel with Stirling Moss. Taruffi made his race debut and won it driving an Alfa, property of Scuderia Ferrari, in 1931. He was a man who threw himself with relish into the fray. On my advice, he promised his wife that in case of victory in the 1957 Mille, he would cease racing. He kept his word by winning the last in the series of these races. Eugenio Castellotti was a young country gentleman. He came from Lodi and had arrived in sports car racing by paying with his own money for the first racing cars. Despite having something less than the perfect style, he was endowed with a great heart. His moment of glory came in the 1956 Mille. Manuel Fangio, a target of contrasting judgments and opinion, not so much upon his skills as a driver, but as a man. I saw him for the first time at Modena in 1949. I watched him for a couple of laps. He had an unusual style. He was perhaps the only one to exit a turn without uprooting the bales of straw at the edge. In 1956, Manuel raced for Ferrari in the official team. He'd already been 3 times world champion. The season rewarded him with a 4th championship victory. Peter Collins, I had a great esteem for him as a driver, as well as a man. He could have become world champion in 1956, but he sportingly withdrew by handing his car to Fangio. His love for car racing was equalled by his mechanical knowledge. Luigi Musso had been a world-class Italian driver. I would say the last of a school of drivers endowed with a perfect style. He had started in sports cars bought with his own cash, and people called him Luigino, later to be changed to Luigi, the Italian professional champion. He remained a gentleman. He died at Reims in 1958. I was especially close to Wolfgang von Trips because he was a young man of great nobility of spirit. He loved any form of sport, particularly sports car racing, and he was a gentleman in racing as he was in life. He was a very quick driver. He was capable of any deed of courage. He died in 1961 when he was about to take the World Championship laurels. Phil Hill was one of the first North American drivers on the World Championship scene. He was a solid, emotive driver who had come from sports car racing. He loved very fast circuits and much less the twisting ones. After 10 years driving with our cars, he won in 1961 the World Championship. When I met Baghetti, I judged him to be a cool, cautious and self-controlled man. The beginning of his career was explosive. He gained immediate success. He was hailed by the press. I'm not sure if this was responsible for it, but I feel it didn't benefit him. His luck seemed to run out. With his previous training as a mechanic and the right naturalness in his driving and a unique self-esteem, Lorenzo Bandini did well in any car. This willpower, confidence, and a great sense of belonging endeared him to me. I'm known for my liking of former motorcyclists, and John Surtees was one of them. With him, I liked his technique, his great love for the sport, and his reliability. He studied the race and trained conscientiously and thoroughly for the event. During the race, Big John lived each minute of the competition. He was a generous competitor and always gave each ounce to the race. After having been world champion 7 times on 2 wheels, he secured the world title in a 158 Ferrari in 1964. In the company of Mike Parks, Scarfiotti made the perfect companion for racing my prototypes, a duo that gave proof of strength and determination to win. Ludovico Scarfiotti was an impetuous character beyond measure, and he won the European mountain event title and in 1966 the Italian Grand Prix. During his 3 years racing for me, Chris Amon didn't achieve the success that he should have had. He won on the sports prototype cars and the Championship of Tasmania, but never a Formula One championship. He was a good, indeed an excellent test driver, a fine, clean driver. He ought to have put more heart into the racing, though. This was an ability that he often lacked. Now, Mario Andretti was a courageous and a generous and a serious professional. Originally from Trieste, he was an idol in America, and we had to wait years to sign him on permanently because of the astronomical sums of money he was winning in the States. When in 1971 he did succeed in racing a whole season in Formula One, he didn't take long in getting to grips with the circuits and in arriving amongst the top drivers. Now, Ickx had the right mixture of daring and cool calculation. In the first year he raced in my cars, he gained experience which promised rewards. He was amongst the drivers who won for Ferrari the most Grand Prix races towards the World Championship. Of Pierino the Terrible, as some of my mechanics used to call him, I mostly remember his sharp and fearless driving in the rain. I was in touch with Regazzoni as far back as 1969, when he was still known as Gianclodio Regazzoni, the year after he had won a memorable Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Then he refined his style and temperament, always daring in its nature, to become an excellent professional. He would always be treated with great respect by his opponents. I've been witness, and not without good results, to De Adamich's craftiness and Mazzario's astuteness. Active, yet not theatrical, Mazzario opted to cast his lot with the newsprint rather than stick with those who had helped him pass to Formula One. Of him, I remember, for his style of driving, the Targa Florio, which he won with Munari in 1972. It was Regazzoni who reassured me in my choice of Lauda, the driver we lacked in the 1974 season. That name was already part of my plans, and there were no second thoughts. Lauda was summoned to Ferrari. He appeared at once to be a reliable young man, punctilious in his training and car preparation, something which came to him naturally. He won the World Championship in 1975 and 77, and when he left he found the time to write about Ferrari and its men, a whole damning report which time has already redressed. Had he decided to stay at Ferrari, he could already have equalled Fangio's record number of world titles. Reutemann followed Lauda. He'd already raced for Ferrari in 1973 in the sports prototype races. The Argentinian proved to be a driver of great skill, plagued by a tortured and worried temperament. Whilst he did secure 4 Grand Prix in 1978, he never quite made it to the world title. He failed and finished an honest career without crowning himself champion of the world. The signing of Villeneuve was born out of a sudden decision which unleashed an enormous sea of protest. I had information on Gilles through a friend. His pedigree was bizarre, a power sledge ace and winner of the Formula Atlantic Championship. I felt that given the thorough training, it ought to have been possible, with the right natural predisposition and a talent, to manufacture a driver. Gilles, with his temperament, immediately won over the hearts of the crowds. He has been an unrelenting champion and gained for Ferrari a great deal of fame. I did love him. I'd been keeping an eye on the South African Jody Scheckter for a couple of years, with much interest and liking, convinced as I was that his exuberance would, with technical help and a professional team, have taken him to the highest international success. He was only able to race with us in 1979, and he did reap the success which I mapped out for him, and proved to be a daring as well as a cool and calculating driver. Didier Pironi was a Frenchman with roots in Friuli. I remember following with much appreciation through TV pictures some of his dogged pursuits and some of his tenacious shrugging off of attackers. He was a true pedigree fighter. He loved high speeds. He arrived at Maranello in 1981 and earned himself everyone's liking and esteem. A serious accident in the 1982 Grand Prix put an end to his chance of ever becoming the first French world champion. After Villeneuve's demise, Alboreto came to the fore, though tied down by contract. Then the name Tambay cropped up. He should have entered our team as far back as 1978, but some circumstance prevented the agreement, for which both parties had so much expectation. Patrick Tambay was an accurate, tireless test driver, a worthwhile driver with a winning streak, the character of an honest professional. Arnoux arrived at Maranello accompanied by an unfortunate reputation as a speed lover. René Arnoux did not only prove to be very fast, but also gifted with an instinctive competitive intelligence. I signed Arnoux up also for another reason, because I remember the fight he gave to the late Gilles at Dijon in the French Grand Prix. In 1983, after a doubtful start to the season, he won 3 Grand Prix and fought to the end for the World Championship title. I signed Michele Alboreto because I felt that this was the Italian sports authorities' wish, but above all, because I believe he's a driver who suited Ferrari, since I had the impression, and not just now, that he's a clean man and a valid driver. Alboreto gave in 1984 more than I expected. He had his shortcomings, though, at Monte Carlo, where he fell victim to the tense atmosphere and made 3 mistakes in 2 days. But I've the highest esteem for him. He confirmed my confidence, and I intend to keep Alboreto, because he's a good driver. He's a man who never chucks it in. He's an optimist. This suits me fine. After the slightly disappointing era of Alboreto and Johansson, Gerhard Berger and latterly Nigel Mansell were entrusted with reviving Ferrari's fortunes. The Austrian won a notable victory at Monza in 1988, the only race of that season not won by McLaren, while Mansell won his very first race for Ferrari, the 1989 Brazilian Grand Prix, and later added a second one in Hungary. In the 1990s, Alain Prost was enrolled to assist Mansell in the battle to contain the all-conquering McLarens. Modernese to the core, Enzo Ferrari has always been revered by his townsfolk. The strength of their admiration can be gauged from the extent of their homage to this grand old man. Enzo Ferrari lived in this block in the Largo Garibaldi. Every morning he would leave for the office, accompanied by his chauffeur and 1 bodyguard. The shop windows in the town centre are proud to display prancing horse memorabilia everywhere. Books, models, photographs, souvenirs of Ferrari cars, and indeed of Enzo Ferrari himself, all are displayed with care and a level of imagination that is guaranteed to halt passers-by in their tracks. Apart from the feelings of warmth that they generate amongst enthusiasts, collecting Ferrari memorabilia can actually prove to be a profitable hobby. To begin with, there are countless books on the subject of Ferrari, published throughout the world in many languages. Over the years, some of these works have become scarce and in some cases virtually unobtainable. A good example are the company's own yearbooks, published in limited runs from 1949 to 1970. Ferrari himself used to hand out copies to factory employees and friends scattered around the world. These modest volumes, each of which provide an annual assessment of the company's activities, were soon commanding astronomical prices from collectors. While on the subject of books, Il Commendatore's own thoughts on motorsport and on successive generations of racing drivers have been published in numerous editions under various titles, and these have often been translated and published successfully outside Italy. Such has been the number of richly detailed books devoted to the subject of Ferrari that it would fill a library all of its own. They contain a healthy diversity of topics and opinions covering all Ferrari's activities, the leading personalities, the various cars, and of course Enzo Ferrari's own life and achievements. Collectors of Ferrari models who are just as enthusiastic as prancing horse bibliophiles are equally spoilt for choice. This is Vincenzo Bossica's 1/43rd scale model of the fabulous GTO. These tiny jewels fit the palm of one's hand, yet reflect every tiny detail of the real thing. Another good example is Bossica's 126 C2 number 27, widely considered to be the ultimate realization of the model maker's art, perfection in miniature. Slightly more offbeat, a number of records have been made, allowing the purchaser to appreciate the strident note of Maranello's engines in their own living rooms. One of many distinguished marque enthusiasts was the celebrated conductor Herbert von Karajan, who once compared the sound of a Ferrari engine to that of a harmonious symphony. The consuming passion for Ferrari has persuaded many aficionados to build up their own shrines to Maranello. In this repair shop, for instance, everything points to a single cult figure, Enzo Ferrari. Perhaps no other sport outside football boasts a band of such dedicated followers. Supporters of the Ferrari cause congregate at circuits all over the world to cheer on Ferrari. It is difficult to imagine any Italian who has not on at least one occasion had cause to celebrate thanks to Ferrari. Journalist and fan Italo Cucci once described Ferrari as the red national team. Today, to own a Ferrari is more than ever to own an exclusive status symbol, an object of intense desire for thousands of motor racing fans. For the lucky few who can afford the running costs, the mere act of driving such a marvel offers unrivaled satisfaction. After Enzo Ferrari's death, it was widely forecast that the price of cars bearing his name would escalate. That didn't take long. Amongst the fanciful prices being quoted at some auctions was a tag of 3 billion lira for a 1958 Tour de France model. This record didn't last for long. Soon afterwards, an anonymous collector acquired a 1961 Berlinetta Gran Turismo for 3.5 billion lira. And which one of us wouldn't like to be in the shoes of wealthy Englishman Sir Charles Brocket, who converted the stables at his castle into an enormous garage to ensure the safekeeping of his private Ferrari collection, believed to be the most valuable in the world. Inevitably, the owners of old cars love to mingle, exchanging information and showing off their pride and joy before admiring crowds. Such exhibitions are commonplace the world over. On the initiative of importers and many wealthy collectors, there are now official Ferrari clubs in many countries. The most notable of these is the one founded in Maranello on the occasion of the marque's 40th anniversary in 1987. Known as the Ferrari Club Italia, it listed Enzo Ferrari himself as its first honorary member. Its aim is to act as an official coordinator between all the world's Ferrari organisations. Article 3 of the club's regulations is a clear indication of its intentions: to spread interest in and provide welfare for Ferrari cars, to set up mutually beneficial exchange schemes between owners, to provide information on the manufacturer, to organise meetings, conferences, competitions, and anything else pertaining to the prancing horse. One of the club's more recent initiatives was the opening in February 1990 of the Ferrari Gallery, a permanent showroom in Maranello. The initial stock of exhibits included a dozen vintage cars and Enzo Ferrari's old office, accurately rebuilt just as it had been at the original factory at Via Trento e Trieste in Modena. This was further proof, as if it were needed, of the esteem in which the Modenese car constructor was held. A man, as Fiat President Gianni Agnelli mused, who exported his country's prestige all around the world and made his countrymen proud to be Italian.
Desidero ringraziare tutti gli sportivi intervenuti ed in particolare il presidente dell'Automobile d'Italia Alessi, che ha scelto Modena, il suo record del miglio, il circuito delle 3 province per celebrare l'80° anniversario dell'ACI. Fatti e nomi che mi riportano all'adolescenza, quando attraverso lo sport l'automobile iniziava la sua meravigliosa evoluzione fino a diventare una conquista di libertà per l'uomo. La Ferrari è presente da 40 anni e continuerà, perché solo nella corsa e dalla corsa scaturisce il progresso e solo nella competizione io vedo la vita.
Enthusiasts the world over say a big thank you to Enzo Ferrari, truly the grand old man of Italian motorsport.